My wife always said she loved me more than anything. But one evening, I found a message on her phone that made me doubt everything. He won't suspect a thing, it read. Who was he? And what was she hiding? I started noticing small details, late-night calls, a new perfume I'd never smelled before, and unexpected absences. Was it just my imagination? Or was the truth much worse? And when my best friend, someone I deeply trusted, became involved, my world began to crumble. What if everyone I loved was playing against me? You have no idea what I discovered and how it changed my life forever. My unfaithful wife thought she could get away with everything until I turned her world upside down. Jack Wright, a successful lawyer from Chicago, always considered himself a lucky man. He had a great job, a spacious suburban home, and a charming wife named Elizabeth. They had been married for 10 years, and Jack was convinced their life together was perfect. But everything changed one ordinary evening when he accidentally noticed something unusual. Elizabeth was sitting in the living room with her phone in hand. She was laughing but quickly hid the screen when Jack entered the room. "Who was that?" he asked with a smile, trying to mask his curiosity. "Oh, it was just Linda," she replied, looking at him with her brown eyes. "She was talking about some silly stuff from work." Jack nodded, but something about her tone didn't seem genuine. He remembered that Linda never called late in the evening. A sense of unease began creeping into his thoughts. The next morning, Jack woke up earlier than usual and saw Elizabeth quickly typing something on her phone before leaving the house. Her behavior seemed increasingly strange, but he didn't want to jump to conclusions. A few days later, Jack decided to act. He began paying attention to the little things. Unexpected late hours at work, a new perfume she'd never used before, and the smiles that appeared on her face when she looked at her phone. These details started forming a puzzle, but the answer to "what's going on" remained elusive. One day, Jack accidentally found a receipt from a restaurant they'd never visited together. The date matched the evening Elizabeth had claimed to be working late. His heart sank. He felt the truth was close, but he wasn't sure he was ready to face it. Jack decided to take a drastic step and installed a hidden camera in the house to understand what Elizabeth was doing when he wasn't around. With each passing day, Jack's suspicions turned into a crushing reality. Since installing the hidden camera, his anxiety had shifted to a painful anticipation. He wasn't sure what he feared more: confirmation of his suspicions or the possibility that the truth could be even worse. One evening, after returning from work, Jack quickly connected to the camera feed on his laptop. The video played at speed. Elizabeth tidying up, cooking dinner, occasionally stopping to respond to messages. Everything seemed normal until a moment when she glanced at the door, as if expecting someone. There was a sparkle in her eyes Jack hadn't seen in a long time. A few minutes later, a stranger entered the room. Jack froze the video, and his heart skipped a beat along with the paused image. The unfamiliar man looked confident, even brazen, but Jack felt he'd seen him somewhere before. His heart raced. He rewound the video and turned on the audio. "Are you sure he won't suspect anything?" the man asked, sitting on the couch as if it were his own home. "Jack? No, he trusts me like a child," Elizabeth replied, laughing. Jack felt a wave of anger surge from his head to his toes. He clenched his fists, but forced himself to keep listening. "We need to be careful," the man said. "If he finds out, it will ruin everything." "He won't find out, Joe," Elizabeth assured him. "You know I've thought of everything." Joe. It was a name Jack didn't want to hear. It was his best friend, the person he trusted with all his heart. Everything fell into place. Elizabeth's meetings, her new habits, her lies. And now Joe was part of this betrayal. Jack couldn't sit still any longer. He turned off his laptop and walked outside, trying to process his emotions. His world was falling apart before his eyes, and he didn't know if he could put it back together. But one thing was clear: he had to act. The next day, Jack called Joe and invited him to lunch. They met at a cozy restaurant where they usually discussed football or new projects. But this time, the conversation was different. "Joe," Jack began, looking him straight in the eye, "I've always thought of you as a brother, but now I want to know the truth. Are you betraying me?" Joe was initially taken aback, but quickly composed himself. "What are you talking about?" "Of course not. "What nonsense," he replied, avoiding direct eye contact. Jack leaned in closer, almost whispering. "Then explain why you were in my house when I wasn't there." Joe remained silent, as if weighing whether it was worth lying. Finally, he looked at Jack and said, "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" Jack nearly shouted, drawing the attention of those around them. "Give me some time," Joe said, lowering his gaze. "I'll explain everything. I just can't right now." Jack paid for lunch and left, leaving Joe sitting at the table. He felt torn apart inside. Elizabeth and Joe, the two people he loved and trusted, were now his enemies. But were they really? Jack sat in his office, feeling the ground shift beneath him. He hadn't slept properly for several nights, his mind consumed with images of Elizabeth and Joe. He watched the hidden camera footage again, trying to find any clue that might reveal the truth. This time, he noticed something he hadn't seen before: Elizabeth and Joe discussing some documents. "You need to sign this by Friday," Joe said, showing her a folder of papers. "Don't worry," Elizabeth replied, taking the pen. "He won't even notice." "And if he does?" Joe asked, his voice tense. "It will ruin everything." "We've taken so many steps to avoid that," she responded. "He's not as clever as you think." Jack paused the video and stared at the screen. What were those documents? Why was Elizabeth signing them? And why was Joe so nervous? His heart pounded faster than usual, but he knew he had to dig deeper. The next day, Jack went to the bank to check his accounts. For years, he had trusted Elizabeth with their financial affairs, but now he was curious if anything suspicious was going on. He wasn't wrong. Over the past few months, large sums of money had been transferred to an unknown account. He felt the ground slipping out from under him. That evening, Jack decided to confront Elizabeth directly. She was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when he walked in. "We need to talk," he said, sitting across from her. "What's wrong?" she asked, looking up. "Can you explain these money transfers to me?" His voice was quiet but full of anger. Elizabeth looked at him as if she didn't understand what he was talking about. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play games with me, Elizabeth." Jack raised his voice. "I've seen the records. You and Joe are up to something, and I want to know what it is." Her face momentarily lost its usual calm, but then she regained her composure. "Jack, you're just being paranoid. There's no us with Joe." "Then explain what those documents are. Why are you signing something I don't know about? And why is money disappearing from our account?" Elizabeth sighed and placed her book on the table. "Fine, if you want the truth." She began but stopped when her phone rang. She quickly grabbed it and looked at the screen. Jack saw the change in her expression. He snatched the phone from her hands despite her protests and saw a message from Joe. "The time is near. Are you ready?" "What does this mean?" Jack shouted, his hands trembling with rage. "You're misunderstanding everything," Elizabeth yelled, trying to take the phone back. "It's not what you think." "Then explain," he said, staring straight into her eyes. "Or I'll go to the police." Elizabeth remained silent. Her face changed, and Jack realized she was hiding something. But before she could say anything, the doorbell shattered the tense silence. Jack walked to the door and opened it. Joe was standing on the porch. "We need to talk," he said, looking at Jack. Jack felt anger and despair swallowing him whole as he sat at the table in his bedroom, holding documents he had accidentally found in Elizabeth's office. They were property deeds for the house they had bought together 10 years ago, but something didn't add up. The owner section only had Elizabeth's name. Alongside them were additional documents hinting at an attempt to transfer all assets without his knowledge. His mind raced with thoughts. He recalled all the strange conversations, glances, and Elizabeth's suspicious laughter. How could he have been so blind? When the door to their house quietly opened and Elizabeth walked in, Jack was already waiting for her in the living room. On the table in front of him lay the same documents. "What is this, Elizabeth?" he asked coldly, pointing at the papers. Elizabeth froze but quickly composed herself, smiling as if nothing had happened. "You've misunderstood," she began, sitting down on the couch. "It's just a formality, Jack." "A formality?" His voice began to rise. "You call trying to steal our house from me a formality?" "Steal?" She feigned shock. It was for our safety. Just simplifying the paperwork. Simplifying? Jack laughed bitterly. Is that why you're working with Joe behind my back? Her face darkened. She realized Jack knew more than she had thought. Listen to me, Jack, she said seriously. It's not what you think. Just what? Jack interrupted her. You just decided to use me? Betray me? And Joe? Is he part of this plan too? Elizabeth was silent for a moment before standing abruptly. If you want the truth, fine, she said, looking him directly in the eyes. Joe and I decided to act because you're too trusting. You never even noticed how your money disappeared on nonsense. We did this for us. For us. Jack felt the blood pounding in his temples. Do you even hear yourself? You're talking as if that justifies your deceit. You never cared about me, Jack. Elizabeth shouted. You were always busy with your job, your perfect life. And me? I was just a shadow in your world. Jack shook his head, trying to process her words. That's your excuse, he said quietly. You betray me to feel important? I didn't betray you, she protested, but her voice was less convincing. It's just the circumstances. At that moment, Joe entered the room. He looked tense, his eyes searching for support from Elizabeth. I think we need to talk, Jack, he began, but Jack raised his hand to stop him. I'm listening, Jack said, clenching his fists. Joe sighed and began explaining that Elizabeth had asked for his help with a financial crisis. They had planned to transfer some of Jack's assets to avoid an imaginary risk of bankruptcy. But now Jack knew it wasn't a crisis, it was fraud. You'll both answer for this, Jack said, rising to his feet. I won't let this slide. Elizabeth rushed to him, trying to stop him. Jack, don't do this, she pleaded. We can fix this. Fix this. His voice was filled with bitterness. This can't be fixed, Elizabeth. You've destroyed everything. He walked out of the house, leaving the two of them in a tense silence. Jack knew this fight was just beginning, and he wouldn't let them win. Jack sat in his car in an empty parking lot. His hands nervously gripped the steering wheel as he reread the message he had received an hour earlier. Want to know the truth? It's much deeper than you think. Meet me at midnight at the Black Rose Bar. A. The anonymous message made his heart race with both anxiety and curiosity. Who was A? And why had they decided to help him? He knew it could be a trap, but he had no choice. Jack got out of the car and walked toward the bar doors, where the next part of this nightmare awaited him. The bar was half empty. Dim lighting, the smell of cheap alcohol, and the muffled hum of conversations created a heavy atmosphere. Jack quickly scanned the room until his eyes settled on a woman in a black coat sitting in the corner, watching him. Her eyes, deep and attentive, seemed to read his thoughts. Jack, she said as he approached. Sit down. We don't have much time. Who are you? He asked, sitting across from her. And how are you connected to all of this? The woman sighed and pulled several folders from her bag. My name is Alice. I used to be a close friend of Elizabeth's until she betrayed me, just like she's betraying you now. Jack felt a wave of anger rise within him. He opened the folders and saw copies of contracts, emails, and even photographs proving that Elizabeth wasn't working alone. It wasn't just Joe. There was another person involved. A lawyer named Thomas Grayson, whom Jack knew as his business partner. Thomas? Jack whispered, flipping through the pages. This can't be true. He's the mastermind behind this operation, Alice confirmed. Elizabeth and Joe are just pawns. Thomas is running the whole show, and his goal is to completely destroy you. He wants your assets, your company, everything. Why are you helping me? Jack asked, eyeing her suspiciously. Because I know what it's like to be a victim. And I want them to pay for what they've done, she replied firmly. Jack felt his anger transform into determination. He wasn't going to sit and wait anymore. He needed to act. What do you suggest? He asked. Alice leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. We need to gather more evidence. Thomas has an office where he keeps all his files. If we find them, they'll be your weapon. Jack nodded. He knew it was risky, but he couldn't stop now. That same night, he and Alice broke into Thomas's office. She knew how to pick the lock, and they slipped inside, staying in the shadows. Jack found a safe and began searching for the keys. But just as he opened it, the office door slammed shut. Thomas stood in the doorway. "Jack," he said with a faint smile. "I knew you'd come." Alice froze in place, but Jack stepped forward. "You've ruined my life, Thomas," he said. "But this isn't the end." Thomas laughed. "You have no idea how right you are. This is just the beginning, Jack." Thomas stood with his arms crossed, his gaze drilling holes into Jack's soul. Behind his smile was a confidence that was terrifying. He knew something Jack didn't, and it was worse than any confession. "You thought you could outsmart me, Jack?" Thomas began, his voice dripping with mockery. "You don't even understand who you're dealing with." Jack cast a quick glance at Alice. She stood to the side, tense, ready for anything. He turned back to Thomas, trying not to reveal his fears. "Then explain it to me," Jack said, barely containing his anger. "What's this game about?" Thomas stepped closer, stopping so their faces were level. "Do you really think this was all Elizabeth's idea?" He laughed. "She's just a cog in a much bigger machine. And that machine is ready to crush you if you keep interfering." "What are you talking about?" Jack asked, trying to understand. Thomas pulled out his phone and showed Jack a video. On the screen were scenes of Elizabeth in a luxury hotel, sitting at a table with two men in suits. Their faces were cold and calculating, and their voices carried the weight of a sentence. "We'll ensure your safety," one of the men said. "But if your husband starts asking too many questions, we'll have to act." "He won't find out," Elizabeth assured them. "I have everything under control." Jack felt his heart clench. This was worse than he could have imagined. Elizabeth was part of a larger scheme, and these men were clearly dangerous. "Who are they?" Jack asked, barely holding back his anger. "They're your worst nightmares," Thomas said. "They work in finance, but their methods are far from legal. Elizabeth struck a deal with them to get what she wanted, and now she's dragged you into this chaos." "Why are you telling me this?" Jack asked, sensing there was more to it. "Because I know they won't stop," Thomas replied, and there was a note of sincerity in his voice. "You have to choose, fight or run. But if you choose to fight, you need to be ready for anything." Jack turned to Alice, who quietly said, "We can stop them, but it's going to be risky." Thomas handed Jack a folder of documents. "Everything you need to know is in here," he said. "But be careful. If they find out you're digging into them, there will be no place to hide." Jack took the folder, but his mind was already spinning. He didn't know whom to trust, Thomas, Alice, or even himself. But he knew one thing. He couldn't stand by any longer. As Jack stepped out of the office, Alice followed close behind. She touched his shoulder, making him stop. "We need to act quickly," she said. "If they suspect anything, we'll all be in danger." "I know," Jack replied. "But now, I want to hear the truth from her." They returned home, but the house was silent. Elizabeth was gone. On the kitchen table lay a note. "Jack, I knew you'd find out, but I couldn't let you interfere. It's too dangerous. I'm sorry." Jack felt his anger and despair mix into a deadly cocktail. He knew he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the whole truth. Jack was awakened by a phone call that shattered the early morning silence. The clock read 5 a.m., and his phone flashed Alice's name. Something about the call felt off. Jack picked up, feeling a growing sense of unease. "Jack," Alice's voice was tense and clipped. "We need to meet. I've found something important." "What happened?" he asked, trying to gauge her tone. "Just trust me," she said. "I'll explain everything in person. Meet me in an hour at the old warehouse on Riverside Drive." Jack wasn't a fan of surprises, but he had no choice. He arrived at the warehouse, where Alice was waiting for him. She was alone, holding a flash drive in her hand. "This could change everything," she said, handing him the drive. "It has proof that Elizabeth and Thomas are working with an international group. But there's something else you need to know." Jack inserted the flash drive into his laptop and began going through the files. His heart sank as he saw photos, contracts, and emails. But one document made him freeze. It mentioned Alice as a key link. "What does this mean?" he asked, looking up at her. Alice looked back at him, her face calm. "It means I worked for them," she admitted. "But I don't want to be part of this game anymore. They used me, just like they're using Elizabeth." Jack felt his trust in her crumble before his eyes. You knew all this and said nothing? His voice turned sharp. You played both sides? It's not as simple as it seems, she said, stepping closer. I had my own reasons. And right now, I'm helping you, aren't I? Or you're just eliminating the competition, he replied coldly. Alice sighed and pulled a gun from her bag. Jack stepped back, never taking his eyes off her. I'm not going to kill you, she said, but you need to understand that you're on your own now. I'll give you everything I know, but after this, we go our separate ways. How can I trust you? He asked. You can't, she replied, but you don't have a choice. Jack knew she was right. He took the flash drive and left the warehouse, feeling his world fall apart again. Alice wasn't who she seemed, but her information might be the key to solving the puzzle. When Jack got home, he started reviewing the flash drive's contents. Among the files were documents confirming Elizabeth's connection to dangerous people. But there were also recordings of conversations suggesting there was someone else controlling the entire operation. Suddenly, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. You've gone too far, Mr. Wright. Back off, or you'll lose everything. Jack felt a cold sweat run down his back. His enemies knew what he was doing, and now his life was in danger. Jack stood in the middle of the room, which had become the stage for a confrontation that could change everything. The table around which he had gathered Elizabeth, Thomas, and Alice was devoid of any friendly atmosphere. Each of them silently watched the others, as if waiting for the first move in a deadly game. Jack, unable to bear the tension, broke the silence first. We all know why we're here, he said, looking at each of them in turn, and it's time to end the lies. Elizabeth, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, crossed her arms. She appeared confident, but her eyes betrayed a hint of anxiety. And what do you want to know, Jack? She asked coldly. That I conspired with Thomas? That I involved Alice? You already know all of that. Jack raised a hand to stop her. I want to know why. Why did you decide to destroy everything we built? Thomas smirked, his voice dripping with disdain. Are you really that naive, Jack? This wasn't we. This was your one-sided story. We just took advantage of what you gave us. Jack felt the anger rising inside him, but he restrained himself. He turned his gaze to Alice, who sat silently, not interfering in the conversation. He knew she was hiding something. And you? He addressed her. Why did you decide to help me if you were involved in this? Alice held his gaze and finally spoke. Because I realized I was tired of being their puppet. I want them to pay for what they've done. Elizabeth laughed, her voice full of disdain. Don't be ridiculous, Alice. You're just as guilty as we are. You're only trying to save your own skin. Jack clenched his fists. His mind was in chaos, but he knew he had to stay focused. Enough, he shouted. We're not leaving here until I get the truth. Thomas crossed his arms and leaned toward Jack. The truth is, we used your trust, he said. Elizabeth wanted more than you could give her, and I just knew how to get it. You were the perfect tool. Jack felt his world collapsing. Elizabeth had betrayed him not only emotionally, but had completely destroyed their life together. But now he saw a weakness in Thomas. Alice, Jack addressed her, do you have evidence of their conspiracy? She nodded and pulled out her phone. Everything is here. But if they find out I kept this, I won't live to see another day. Elizabeth jumped up from her seat. You liar, she screamed, rushing toward Alice. Jack stepped between them, stopping the conflict. But before he could say anything, the doors suddenly swung open. Two men in black suits entered the room. We won't let you ruin our operation, one of them said. Jack realized these were the people Elizabeth had been working with. The situation had spiraled out of control, and now their lives were in danger. The room was steeped in tense silence. Thomas, who until now had seemed confident and composed, suddenly changed. His expression grew serious, and his voice took on an unfamiliar tone of sincerity. You think you know everything? He addressed everyone in the room. But you have no idea what you're really caught up in. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, her face showing distrust. What is this game, Thomas? She asked coldly. You've always been a manipulator, but this time you've gone too far. This isn't a game, Thomas replied sharply, turning his gaze to Jack. You thought I was your enemy? I've been trying to bring this organization down from the inside. Jack felt his anger slowly give way to curiosity. He leaned forward, listening intently to every word Thomas said. "Prove it," Jack said. "Why should I trust you after everything you've done?" Thomas pulled a flash drive from the inner pocket of his jacket and tossed it onto the table in front of Jack. "Here are recordings that prove I'm working against them," he said. "Videos, conversations, financial documents. I'm risking my life to get this to someone who can stop them." Elizabeth laughed loudly. "Do you really expect us to believe you?" she asked. "This is just another one of your tricks." "Then you're in danger too, Elizabeth," Thomas replied, his voice turning icy. "If this organization decides you're no longer useful, they'll get rid of you just as easily as everyone else." Alice, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "If what he's saying is true, then we're all in mortal danger," she said. "We need to work together, no matter how it sounds." Jack looked at her, trying to determine if he could trust Alice after everything that had happened. But he knew they couldn't afford internal conflicts right now. "Fine," Jack said, making his decision. "We'll review these recordings. But if this is another one of your games, Thomas, I'll personally make sure you pay for it." Thomas nodded, his face remaining serious. "You're missing the most important thing," he said. "They already know we're here. We have no more than an hour to gather everything and disappear." Elizabeth looked confused. "What do you mean? How did they find out?" "They're always watching," Thomas replied. "You have no idea how far their reach extends." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He stood up and began gathering his things. "We need to find a safe place where we can review these recordings and come up with a plan," he said. Alice nodded. "I know a place where no one will find us, but we need to move quickly." They hurried out of the room, the tension between them palpable. Each of them knew that any mistake could be fatal. When they reached Alice's hideout, Jack plugged in the flash drive and started reviewing the recordings. The screen displayed footage from hidden cameras, showing high-ranking individuals discussing the organization's plans. Their voices were calm, but that only made them more chilling. "We need to eliminate any threat," one of the men said. "This group must no longer exist." Jack realized these people were willing to do anything to maintain their power. But now he had evidence, and he was ready to act. Jack sat in the dark room, holding his phone. Beside him lay the flash drive, the only evidence that could expose the organization. He understood the risks were enormous, but staying silent could cost him even more. He knew he had only one option: to go to the media. "It's dangerous," Alice warned, watching him. "They won't stop until they find us." "And if we do nothing, they'll win," Jack replied, his voice filled with determination. "I won't let them continue." Elizabeth, sitting in the corner, remained silent, but her face expressed fear and despair. She knew that if Jack took this step, it would change everything forever. "You realize they'll find you," she finally said. "And all of us, too." "Maybe," Jack said, standing up, "but I'm not going to sit and do nothing." He called one of the most influential journalists in the city, Carter Grayson. Carter was known for his exposés, and Jack knew that if anyone could help, it was him. An hour later, they met at a cafe on the outskirts of the city. Jack handed Carter the flash drive, briefly explaining the situation. "If this is true," Carter said, looking at the contents of the flash drive, "this could be the biggest investigation of my career. But you understand you're challenging some very dangerous people?" "I don't have a choice anymore," Jack replied. Carter nodded and promised to start working on it immediately. But Jack felt this was just the beginning of a new nightmare. When he returned to the hideout, Alice was waiting for him with alarming news. "They know," she said. "I just got a message. They know you gave the evidence to a journalist." Jack felt his heart tighten. "What did the message say?" he asked. Alice showed him her phone. The message was short but terrifying. "You've made a huge mistake. We're coming for you." Elizabeth stood up, her face pale. "They're going to come for us now," she said. "We're all in danger." Jack tried to reassure her, but he was panicking inside. He realized they were all trapped. But he also knew this was their chance to bring down the organization. Carter called late that night. His voice was tense. "Jack, you won't believe what I've found. It's worse than I thought. But they've already tried to hack my servers." We need to act fast. Jack decided to meet with Carter to discuss the next steps. But when he arrived at the journalist's office, he was met with an empty room. On the desk lay a notebook with a short message. He knew too much. You're next. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He realized they were one step ahead, and now he needed to find a new way to expose them. Jack sat in the dimly lit room, staring at the note he had found in Carter's office. His heart raced with every passing second. Who were these people, and how far were they willing to go to stop him? It all felt like a nightmare, but there was no way out. He needed answers, and he knew where to look for them. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. I know what you need. Meet me at warehouse number 14, 11 p.m. Jack froze for a moment, trying to assess the risk, but he couldn't ignore the possibility of learning more. Who is it? Alice asked, watching him. Maybe it's the answer we need, he replied. Elizabeth, who had remained silent until now, suddenly spoke. You're going to go? This could be a trap, Jack. I know, he said, but I don't have a choice. That evening, Jack arrived at the specified address. The warehouse looked abandoned, but lights were on inside. He entered cautiously, keeping his hand on the knife in his pocket. Inside, a middle-aged man with short dark hair was waiting for him. He looked ordinary, but his eyes revealed experience and pain. You're Jack, the stranger said. And who are you? Jack asked. My name is Mark, the man said. And I know what you're trying to do. I was once in your position. Jack tensed. What do you mean? Mark pulled a folder from his backpack and tossed it onto the table. Inside were photos, documents, and letters that revealed the scale of the organization's operations. But one thing stood out, a letter signed by Elizabeth. Is this a joke? Jack asked coldly, pointing at the document. No, Mark replied. She's been working with them longer than you think. Jack felt his heart tighten again. He returned home, where Elizabeth and Alice were waiting for him. What happened? Alice asked, noticing the look on his face. You, Jack said, looking at Elizabeth, betrayed me. Again. Elizabeth tried to respond, but Jack threw the documents onto the table. Explain this, he shouted. Elizabeth lowered her head. Her voice was quiet, but filled with despair. I had my reasons, Jack, she said. They forced me. I didn't have a choice. You always have a choice, Jack yelled. Alice, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke. If that's true, then you need to help us. We can't do this without you. Elizabeth lifted her head and looked at them. If I do this, it could mean the end for all of us, she said. It's already the end, Jack replied. Either you help us, or we're all done for. Elizabeth sighed and finally agreed. She began to share information about the organization's contacts, their schemes, and plans. She knew her life was now also in danger, but she decided to see it through to the end. As they worked on the plan, Alice received a message. You're playing with fire. The next move is ours. Jack stood by the window, watching the quiet street, lost in thought. Recent events had turned his life into an endless survival game. He still couldn't shake the feeling that no one could be trusted. Even Elizabeth, who seemed to have finally taken his side, didn't inspire confidence. What now? Alice asked, sitting at the table surrounded by scattered documents. Jack turned, his expression serious. We have to move faster, he said. They won't give us much time. Elizabeth, sitting to the side, suddenly raised her head. I know how we can access their internal base, she said. Her voice was calm, but Jack detected something unsettling in it. And how exactly? He asked, narrowing his eyes. I still have connections, she admitted. I know who we can convince to help us. Connections? Alice shot up from her seat. Are you trying to play both sides again? No. Elizabeth insisted, but her voice wavered. I want to make things right. Jack remained silent, trying to decide if it was worth the risk. But he knew this might be their only chance. Fine, he said at last. But if you betray us, it'll be your last mistake. Elizabeth nodded nervously, but her eyes avoided his gaze. The next day, they set out to meet the person Elizabeth called the key to success. He was a senior member of the organization who had once helped Elizabeth in her dealings. They met in an abandoned warehouse outside the city. The man was tall, with a sharp gaze that radiated danger. "You know you're risking your life showing up here," he said, looking at Elizabeth. "I know," she replied, "but I have a proposal that benefits us both." Jack listened to the conversation, feeling his suspicions grow. Elizabeth discussed the details of a deal that seemed too risky. The man agreed to help, but on one condition. He wanted part of the evidence they had already gathered. "It's a trap," Alice whispered to Jack. "I know," he replied quietly, "but we don't have a choice." When they returned to the hideout, Jack felt that something was off. Elizabeth was acting strange, and her glances became even more evasive. That evening, as everyone prepared for bed, he decided to check her room. On her phone, he found messages confirming his worst fears. Elizabeth had been negotiating with the organization to betray the group in exchange for protection. Jack approached her, holding the phone in his hand. "What is this?" he asked, his voice as cold as ice. Elizabeth turned pale. "Jack, I can explain," she began, but he cut her off. "You had your chance to explain. You betrayed us again." Alice entered the room, hearing their voices. "What's going on?" she asked. "She made a deal with the organization," Jack said. "She was going to turn us in to save herself?" Alice clutched her head, her face full of rage. "We can't trust her anymore," she yelled. Elizabeth began to cry, but Jack no longer felt any pity for her. "Get out," he said. "If you stay here, we're all dead." Elizabeth left, leaving the two of them in tense silence. Jack and Alice knew they were now on their own against a powerful force, but they also understood they couldn't give up. Jack didn't expect to see Elizabeth again. After she left, the door remained closed not just to her, but to the memories that had kept them together. But when she knocked late at night, looking worn and frightened, his emotions were mixed. Alice, standing beside him, immediately tensed. "What are you doing here?" Alice asked sharply. Elizabeth raised her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I need to talk to you," she said softly. "It's important." Jack looked at her, his gaze heavy with distrust. "We've heard that before," he said. "Why should we believe you this time?" Elizabeth lowered her head, searching for the words that might convince them. "Because they're blackmailing me," she admitted. "If I don't do what they demand, they'll kill me. But I've learned something important, information that can stop them." Alice laughed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "And you think we'll believe you?" she asked. "You've already betrayed us. You were ready to turn us in to save yourself." "I know I made a mistake," Elizabeth replied. "But if we don't unite now, they'll destroy us all." Jack, holding back his emotions, nodded toward a chair. "Fine," he said. "Sit down and tell us everything you know." Elizabeth sat, her hands trembling. She began to explain the organization's plan to use her to infiltrate their small group and destroy it from within. She described their resources, contacts, and details of their next operation. "They want me to go back and find out where you're hiding," she admitted. "But I couldn't do it. I want to help you." Alice rose from her chair, her face full of anger. "You want to help?" she shouted. "After everything you've done? How can we be sure this isn't another one of your games?" Jack raised a hand, stopping Alice. "Our last mistake." "Calm down," he said. "If she's telling the truth, this could be our chance. But if it's a lie—" "It's not a lie," Elizabeth interrupted. "I have proof." She pulled out her phone and showed them recordings of conversations and documents that supported her claims. Jack reviewed everything carefully, but even that couldn't completely convince him. "If this is a trap, you'll regret it," he warned. Elizabeth nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. The next few days were critical. Elizabeth helped Jack and Alice develop a plan to expose the organization, but the tension between them remained. Every conversation ended in accusations and distrust. One evening, while Jack was working through documents, Alice entered the room. "Do you really think she's changed?" Alice asked. "I don't know," he replied. "But right now, we don't have another choice." Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by the sound of an explosion. They ran outside and saw the building they were hiding in engulfed in flames. Elizabeth stood nearby, her face covered in ash. They found us, she said, gasping for breath. We have to run. Jack and Alice exchanged glances. Their plan was now in jeopardy, and they had to act quickly. Jack sat silently, studying the layout of the organization's headquarters, which they had obtained thanks to Elizabeth's recordings. The map was detailed, marking key entrances and exits, but even with it, the operation was incredibly risky. He knew this was their last chance. Are you sure we can do this? Alice asked, her voice tense. No, Jack admitted, but it's the only way to end this. Elizabeth, standing nearby, looked exhausted but determined. They trust me, she said. If I play my part right, you'll be able to get inside. And if they figure it out? Alice asked, casting a skeptical look at her. Elizabeth didn't answer, but her eyes revealed her fear. She understood that the stakes were too high, and a second betrayal would be her last. The operation began late at night. Elizabeth entered the headquarters through the main entrance, carrying a briefcase filled with fake documents meant to prove her loyalty. Jack and Alice waited for her signal, hidden in the shadows. Inside, Elizabeth calmly passed through security. She was greeted by familiar faces, but the tension in the air was palpable. She knew every move she made was being closely watched. You're right on time, one of the senior members said as she entered the meeting room. We have a lot of work to do. I'm ready, she replied, keeping her composure. Meanwhile, Jack and Alice entered the building through the ventilation system. They moved slowly, avoiding cameras and guards. Their goal was simple: find the server room and copy all the data to expose the organization. When they reached the room, Jack quickly plugged a flash drive into the central computer. It took a few minutes for the data to start downloading. But suddenly, the door opened and a guard appeared. What's going on here? He asked, pulling out his weapon. Alice didn't hesitate. She rushed at him, delivering a blow that knocked him unconscious. Jack gave her a grateful look. We need to hurry, she said, shutting the door. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was distracting the members of the organization, leading them in the wrong direction. She managed to gather vital information and relate it to Jack through a hidden communication device. But her lies began to raise suspicions. You seem nervous, one of the men said, his gaze cold. Just a stressful day, she replied with a smile. But her deception was uncovered when an alarm blared, signaling a breach. Elizabeth realized she'd been exposed, and now her life was in danger. You betrayed us, the man said, drawing his gun. If you kill me, you'll get nothing, she replied, trying to buy time. At that moment, Jack and Alice burst into the room. A fierce fight ensued, but they managed to subdue the guards and rescue Elizabeth. We've got everything we need, Jack said, holding up the flash drive. Now we need to get out of here. They barely escaped the building before it exploded. The organization destroyed its own headquarters to cover its tracks, but Jack knew he had enough evidence to expose them. Weeks later, journalists worldwide published exposés based on the data Jack had given to the media. The organization was exposed, and many of its members ended up behind bars. Elizabeth disappeared, leaving behind only a short note: I'll try to find forgiveness. Jack and Alice sat in a quiet cafe, watching the news. They knew the battle was over, but the scars from betrayal and loss would stay with them forever. What would you have done in Jack's place?